Did you ever feel stupid in Star Trek? Like...
So I was quite disappointed when I saw this interview with Colm Meaney on the Tommy Tiernan show, because I thought it was such a missed opportunity. Like, why would you not ask him about Up the Long Ladder? But then I figured, like, Tommy Tiernan probably doesn't even know the first thing about that, and the whole point of his show is that he brings guests on and doesn't really know what their deal is. So, look, fair. I still think it's a missed opportunity though. But Star Trek, The Next Generation, let's talk about it. It's a show of wildly varying quality, to say the least. On the one hand, you have something like The Inner Light, which is just absolutely transcendent and beautiful, and digs into, you know, philosophical, ethical questions. Like Picard, spoilers, Picard lives an entire lifetime on this planet with these people, and then he's forced to just go back to the Enterprise as if nothing happened. I mean, what did that do to a person? You know, it's fascinating. Then you have something like Sub Rosa, where Beverly Crusher falls in love with the ghost of her grandmother's lover or something, and that's just the story. And then you have Up the Long Ladder. Apparently, and I can't get a source on this, Colm Meaney, the Irish actor on Star Trek The Next Generation, was quite unhappy about this episode, but I can't actually get a source on that, so I don't know. I do think it's evidence enough though that he's barely in it. This is his only scene, and he has barely any dialogue, and he looks absolutely disgusted. But anyway, who am I? I'm outstanding in my field, and I'm here to discuss Irish representation in TV and movies. If you'd like to see more content like this, please like and subscribe. And this video might be a little less academic than my last video, simply because my feelings on this episode cannot be contained. So I apologise if I come across at times as slightly unprofessional, but I'm just so worked up about this episode. I mean, firstly, like, I only ever saw this once when I was younger and it scarred me for life. And then I had to rewatch it for the purposes of this video. No regrets, maybe a few regrets. Particularly this scene, I ended up rewatching it over and over. I don't know why. There was so much to dig into. And, you know, by the end of it, I was like, oh, you know, I would die happy if I never have to see this scene again. So look, be grateful that you have someone of my caliber, you know, willing to discuss these things with you.
You're a saint. Wow. Yes, in a way.
Firstly, Star Trek The Next Generation is set in the 24th century and follows the adventures of the Starfleet crew of the Federation starship Enterprise D. And this episode opens with the Enterprise receiving a distress call from a human colony on the planet Brimlode 5. And this colony turns out to have been founded by the crew of SS Mariposa, a freighter that was launched from Earth several hundred years earlier. The colony are followers of an early 22nd century philosopher who advocated returning to an agrarian lifestyle, and this is the episode's justification for the Irish depiction being essentially that of 19th century stereotypes, you know, pre-industrial, so on. So, okay, fair enough. Their leader is Danilo O'Dell. Meanwhile, Worf collapses on the bridge and he's brought to sick bay, where he's embarrassed to learn that he has the Klingon equivalent of measles. But Dr. Blawski very kindly agrees to protect his privacy, and later on, to thank her, Worf treats her to this Klingon tea ceremony. He warns her that the tea is deadly, but Dr. Blawski takes an antidote and drinks it anyway, which is a nice little gesture, and shows a sharing of cultures. Oh, I think I sense a theme. And Danilo O'Dell, the leader of the colony, has a hot-tempered daughter called Brenna, and Riker is instantly attracted to her because she tells him off, I suppose. And she's fiery. She also, weirdly, calls her dad Donald! Which, you know, is Irish for granddad. It's funny, no one on the cast spotted that. Oh, yeah, because all of the people playing the Irish roles were English. Interesting. So Riker takes Brenna to his quarters so she can wash her feet. And then she asks him, seemingly apropos of nothing,
William, is something wrong?
What do you mean?
Do you not like girls?
Riker, she's under your protection. And she's from a colony that's way less advanced than yours. Does that not give you pause at all? But you know, I like to think that the morning after, he just chased Brenna away by asking her a bunch of really specific questions.
Have you ever walked out of a mall into a huge parking area and realized you'd forgotten where you parked your car?
Ever gone mountain biking? What do you want to be when you grow up? What's the right tip? Have you called a plumber to your home lately? How superstitious are you? How much money would it take to make you spend a night in a cemetery?
Anyway, it turns out that there is also a second colony that was also planted by the SS Mariposa. And the Enterprise are introduced to this colony's Prime Minister, Walter Granger, who welcomes them to visit. So, as always, Picard sends his most valuable members of staff from the bridge, Commander Riker and Lieutenant Worf and Dr. Pulaski. And they quickly notice that there's something amiss on this colony.
Triplets? Or if there is something damn odd going on here.
As it turns out, this colony turned to cloning because only 5 survivors were left after their ship crashed, and this was insufficient to establish a stable gene pool. So for the last few hundred years, the Mariposans have been cloning themselves, and now they're in danger of dying out because of replicative fading. And each subsequent generation introduces additional minor flaws into the genetic code, which within a few more generations will make further clones non-viable. Anyway, the Mariposans ask the Enterprise crew to give samples of their DNA to create new clones. Riker refuses because he values his uniqueness. So they kidnap him and use his DNA anyway to clone him, as well as Pulaski. And when they discover this, they beam right down onto the colony and kill the clones because they didn't consent to have these clones made from their bodies. So upon learning this, the Prime Minister Granger is furious, but Picard and Pulaski suggest that they partner with the Bringlogi to create a viable gene pool. Initially, the colonies distrust each other, but they eventually agree to merge their societies. The end. Oh, and Brenna is naturally horrified to learn that, you know, she's going to be forced to marry and breed, but she quickly comes around to the idea when Picard tells her she'll be marrying someone important.
3 husbands.
Uh-huh.
Oh god, I hate this so much. Anyway, it's a weirdly structured episode in that really this cloning plot is your A plot, and yet it's only introduced like 3/4 of the way into the episode. Then the Space Irish are your B plot. The Worf and Pulaski thing, which kind of is really only 2 scenes out of the whole episode, could be like seen as a C plot, I guess. And then Riker and Brenna's little romance that goes nowhere, thank god it goes nowhere because I couldn't deal with any more of those scenes, is your D plot. I want to note here before we get into the stereotypes that this wasn't the first time that Star Trek The Next Generation like massively failed in representing the culture and ended up generalizing and creating a very offensive portrayal. Season 1's Code of Honor comes to mind. I'm not ignoring such depictions or suggesting that Irish stereotypes are in any way on the same level as these African stereotypes, but I'm just more qualified to speak on the Irish matter, so just to emphasize that. But with regards to our stereotypes anyway, It's pretty easy to spot the stage Irish man in all this. Danilo O'Dell is hard drinking and garrulous. He's a little sly as well. I did my previous video was on the stage Irishman, so if you're interested in checking that out, I'll give a link up above there. It goes into Seamus Finnegan, Harry Potter, and the stage Irishman, so you might be interested in checking that out. But funnily enough, Danilo O'Dell's portrayal in this episode is like the least offensive part of it all. I love how this one person on Reddit pointed out that the most offensive part of the episode was actually the suggestion that an Irishman couldn't handle Klingon alcohol.
That's what I call a wee drop of the creature.
So the stereotypes in this episode are really much more complicated than what we've previously been discussing. And first off, I want to look at this notion of the Irish as chaotic and dirty. And there are some very real historic roots to this stereotype. Emigration and mass emigration was a huge phenomenon in Ireland even before the famine of the mid-19th century. 2.1 million people during this time were permanently removed from their homeland. So that's the period we often focus on. And this is because the famine emigration was a massive spike in a demographic curve. And it was a very panicked emigration, more so than a choice. Many people couldn't afford to get a passage to America, for instance, so they would often Liverpool and other port cities in England would be kind of temporary points for them before they would eventually be able to save up, or perhaps their families would send them money and they'd be able to go to America. You got these very crowded ports with many Irish people who had brought nothing with them, because in their panicked rush from home maybe they had nothing to bring to begin with, and so this English view of the Irish as dirty, as chaotic, had some real roots. During the famine itself, particularly in the year known as Black 47, which is one of the worst years of the famine, but actually no blight materialised in that year, yet it was still seen as incredibly disastrous, because partly because the greater geographical mobility of people countrywide meant that the spread of fever and disease around Ireland became a huge problem, even bigger than before. And the failure of the Liberal government in Britain to institute a Fever Act, which had been supposed to come into place the year before, meant that there was very little infrastructure to deal with this spread of disease and fever. And so you got massive overcrowding in workhouses and, of course, on the ships that were carrying many of these emigrants. Kieran O'Meara, who in his 2011 book The Great Famine describes the conditions on one of these ships. The arrival of the Elizabeth and Sarah signalled an abrupt change, anticipating on a small scale the chaotic scenes of fever and death that would reign the following season. Docking in a most horrible state of disease, filth and destitution, conditions on board the 230-ton brig were reported to be closer to those aboard an African slaver than a vessel coming from a part of the United Kingdom. Instead of the advertised 155 passengers, the Elizabeth and Sarah carried 276. Insufficient water had been brought on board, the casks had leaked, and no food provision at all had been made for the passengers. The vessel was horrible and disgusting beyond the power of language to describe. And these images give you some indication of that perception as well, of the very real panic that many in England felt with this onslaught, and particularly this fatigue with charity that set in around the later years of the famine. But then you have post-famine emigration, which continues well into the later 19th century, and also the Fenian movement, and this somewhat changed the characterization of the Irish stereotype. Edward Hirsch, in his essay The Imaginary Irish Peasant, talks about how with the rise of the Fenian movement in the 1860s, the Irish figure became a more animalistic and subhuman figure. And then you had the Gaelic literary revival, which we also talked about in the last video, which brought about this kind of romanticization. So what Edward Hirsch talks about, he posits that we get this Irish peasant as a counter narrative to the stage Irishman. So this kind of the romanticized Irish peasant. I think it's a bit more complicated than that, but it's certainly an interesting opposition you have there. And you definitely see this opposition play out in Up the Long Ladder. You get this constant vacillation between the more cartoonish portrayals of the Irish and then this more romantic view, particularly with characters such as Brenna. I mean, I don't find Brenna a flattering portrayal of an Irish woman.
Do you not like girls?
But evidently we're supposed to admire her.
This is going to work. These people will need your strength, your guidance.
Oh, damn.
And this tension between romanticizing and demonizing the Irish also plays out in the contradictory message of this episode itself. Up the Long Ladder was penned by Melinda Snodgrass, who is also responsible for the brilliant episode Measure of a Man just earlier this season.
I don't understand.
What is he? A machine. Is he? Are you sure? Yes. You see, he's met 2 of your 3 criteria for sentience, so what if he meets the 3rd? Consciousness in even the smallest degree. What is he then? I don't know.
And Snodgrass explained in writing Up the Long Ladder, she had the intention of criticizing the closed-door immigration policy that she could see developing in the US at the time. This had to do with the Immigration Reform and Control Act that was passed in 1986 with the aim of reducing illegal immigration. Up the Long Ladder first aired in 1989, and this was the same year that legal immigration flows in the US surpassed 1 million for the first time since 1914. It was evidently a very topical issue at the time. So her argument was that the episode celebrates the differences, how, you know, the energy that another culture brings can be beneficial to us, and that's a message I can totally get on board with. There's just one problem though, that's not what this episode is about. This episode isn't about the Enterprise learning to live with a new culture. It's about the Enterprise briefly having a new culture stay in their ship before they then run into another plotline which neatly takes care of that first plotline. And that's really what it's about. So you have these 2 plots really grafted onto each other, the cloning plot and the Space Irish plot, which we were talking about earlier, which really could have constituted 2 separate episodes. And, you know, then to add to the mess, you have these like loose ends, like with the Worf-Pulaski plotline that doesn't really go anywhere. And then, you know, Riker, Brenna, oh God, don't get me started. Are we really playing this scene again? Yes. So really, you know, it's about the Mariposans, this society that have been cloning for so long that they've lost all interest in reproduction, that they've lost a lot of human qualities, I suppose. It's really about them, you know, learning to live with the Irish, which isn't quite as compelling, you know, as it could have been. Now you can see in a way, due to the status quo nature of TV writing, how, you know, you couldn't have these characters staying on permanently. I'm certainly grateful that they weren't recurring members of the cast, but let's imagine for a second that they weren't walking stereotypes. I mean, wouldn't it be interesting to see how the Enterprise, how Picard, Riker, Worf, you know, how they deal with this new presence? Wouldn't that have been an interesting arc? Instead, in an attempt to get rid of the Irish, the episode reaches this absolutely horrifying conclusion, and there's really just no way around it.
And while this whole episode is touting the importance of being able to consent to what happens to your body, as we see with the cloning plotline, it turns out that right to consent only applies to, you know, our good friends on the Enterprise. because the women in the Bringlogi, and the men for that matter, have not consented to this. And you might say, yeah, Picard is giving them a choice. Firstly, we only hear him extending that choice to Brenna. And secondly, it's not really a choice, because if you're confronting a way less sophisticated civilization that's not up to date with the technology of your current time, if you're confronting them with either exile from each other, or, you know, this forced union, then I think I know what they're going to choose.
This isn't Star Trek The Next Generation, the optimistic show about diplomacy, about exploring new worlds, about peace and progressiveness. This is Black Mirror. This is Get Out. You know, this is a situation where people are being literally used as breeding stock, and that is not subtext, that is the actual text. They say breeding stock. So these people are being treated like the livestock they brought with them. Look, though, it is easy for me to sit here and criticize one episode out of, you know, several seasons of Star Trek The Next Generation, not to mention Deep Space Nine, both of which feature quite heavily the character of O'Brien, played by Colm Meaney, who, by all accounts, is a very nuanced portrayal of an Irish man. Rather, he's a character whose Irishness is not an issue. It is part of the character, but it's not something that's played for laughs, or used for caricature. I don't know. I'm not going to watch all of these episodes. I could. I'm not going to. So yeah, it is much easier for me to just piece apart this one unfortunate episode. O'Brien was a very loved character. Like, a lot of people liked his performance, apparently in this particular scene. I can't play the audio for copyright reasons, but Colm Meaney singing the Minstrel Boy, like, what's not to like? What fascinates me about this episode is just how much it gets wrong. Even when you leave aside the stereotypes, it messes up the core message, you know, which is supposed to be about the positives of immigration. It's a very, it ends up being a very weak kind of nod to the idea, when it could have actually interestingly incorporated those two cultures and told a good story. So I think that's what fascinates me about this episode.
So my advice for the Star Trek The Next Generation writers, for the writers of a show that aired during the 1990s, I'm so relevant. But my advice for them would be, firstly, do some base level research into the culture that you're representing or depicting, so that if you are going to use stereotypes, at least you know where those stereotypes are rooted, and then maybe you can subvert them or comment on them in an interesting way. Secondly, try your very best to cast actors in the roles who actually come from the culture that you're depicting. I'm not saying that English actors can't play Irish roles. Like Judi Dench in Philomena, in my opinion, proves that entirely wrong. But in general, it's more likely that if you have English actors, they're not going to pick up on the inaccuracies in your writing. Even small things that can be easily fixed, like, you know, Dado. Like, Brenna could have easily said something else, called him something else, and it would have just been funny, you know, and it wouldn't have been a, like, little inaccuracy that's just annoying for people who actually know the culture. And finally, if you're going to dig into a topic like immigration, be sure not to just pay it lip service, you know, don't just do it in a superficial way. There are other episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation that really deal with ethical questions and don't just brush them aside. For instance, with The Measure of a Man, which, again, Melinda Snodgrass also wrote, which, you know, digs into the whole question of, is Data alive? What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be sentient? Does it in 40 minutes, I might add. It is possible to actually explore these issues seriously. Immigration is not just a bunch of people arriving and spending some time with you and then leaving again, you know. Immigration is long term, so, you know, there were ways that they could have actually made this really interesting and even a long-term arc. It would have taken a lot more research and avoidance of stereotypes, but you know, maybe we could have gotten something interesting out of it. That's all.
So look, I know some Irish people found this episode wasn't that offensive. Some people did. We're all entitled to our own opinions, I guess, but just be aware mine is the right opinion. Like, even Jonathan Frakes thinks so.
You're right. It's fact. Yes.
Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this. I'm really excited to discuss more Irish representation in media, and I swear I will do a positive video sometime. You know, it's just much more fun being negative, and also it gets more views. So thank you, and see you next time.